These are the most disturbing crimes that happen at Taco Bell, and as the video goes on, the cases only get worse. Around 7:19 p.m. on August 14, 2024, a 25-year-old woman named Megan Kellerman of Stowe, Ohio, pulled into the Taco Bell drive-thru on Graham Road with her dog Penny to pick up her order. It was a typical Wednesday evening, with people grabbing dinner after work and heading home. Megan was waiting in the drive-thru when a driver pulled in behind her, and suddenly he began honking at her, and moments later the driver even bumped the rear end of her car. Now the impact was minor, but it was more than enough to make her feel unsafe, so she acted accordingly. Frightened, she called her father to explain things, but little did she know that things were about to go from bad to worse. Megan, who just graduated with her MBA from Cleveland State University in May of 2024, was described as the kind of person who liked helping others and constantly volunteered with Girls on the Run of Northeast Ohio, a youth program that mentors young girls through running and building confidence. Now the man who drove in behind her was 53-year-old Jason Williams, and according to witnesses at the scene, Jason immediately became agitated while Megan was placing her order and then suddenly rammed his vehicle into hers. Now Megan realized that she wasn't just dealing with an angry person, but someone who was actually dangerous, and what made her situation even worse was the fact that she just couldn't leave. You see, this Taco Bell drive-thru had a serious design problem. It was a one-lane road with a high curb on one side and a steep drop on the other, which means that there was literally no way for Megan to escape. She couldn't drive around the cars in front of her, and she couldn't back up because Jason was right behind her, and she couldn't pull off to the side because of the curb. Instead, she used the drive-thru intercom to urgently ask the Taco Bell employees to call 911, after which she called her dad. Now during that call, Megan explained that some guy had hit her car and was acting crazy, and that she couldn't leave because he was boxed in. And while Nicholas Kielman, Megan's dad, was still on the phone with his daughter, he suddenly heard her scream.
And the last thing you hear on the telephone is your daughter screaming, he is out of the car. And then I hear a pop. So I'm yelling through the phone, Megan, talk to me.
Jason had gotten out of his vehicle, walked up to Megan's side window with a handgun, and fired 2 shots at point-blank range. But Jason wasn't done yet. After shooting Megan, he calmly walked back to his own car, got inside, and placed a gun under his chin, and then left this earth on his own. Everything happened so fast that the people at the Taco Bell parking lot didn't know what to do, but a handful of witnesses saw what happened and immediately dialed 911. Now, police reports indicate that dispatchers received at least 14 separate emergency calls about the shooting, and one of those calls went like this.
I'm at the Taco Bell on Graham Road and Hudson Drive, and a man just shot somebody and then shot himself in the head.
Now paramedics were dispatched shortly afterwards, but reaching the drive-thru was actually pretty difficult. The single lane left emergency vehicles trapped behind cars, and unable to drive up where the incident had occurred, paramedics were forced to park nearby and run the rest of the way, adding crucial seconds before they could actually reach the injured. And despite their efforts, it was already too late. According to the Summit County Medical Examiner, Megan was shot in the neck, causing fatal injuries, and so both Megan and Jason were pronounced dead at the scene. Now law enforcement officials immediately secured the area and called in the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation to assist. This is because homicides in Stowe are extremely rare. Now the officers also safely removed Megan's dog, Penny, from the passenger seat, after which they proceeded to search Jason's car, where they found some alcohol and a loaded gun. As investigators dug into Jason's background, it became clear that this wasn't just a random guy having a bad day. He had a history that should have kept him far from a gun, and multiple warning signs that somehow went ignored. Jason lived in Cuyahoga Falls and apparently had a long history of alcohol-related offenses and weapons charges. One of these incidents was in 1994, when Jason ran his car into the ditch on the East Pioneer Trail in Aurora, and when police tried to help, they discovered Jason drunk and carrying a .44 caliber revolver inside his car. He was charged with his first DUI, which led to his license being suspended, and when the case went to trial, a Portage County grand jury indicted Jason on a charge of carrying a concealed weapon. And a couple of months later, Jason was picked up again by Stowe police for driving, even though his license was still suspended from the DUI. However, the court records show that he cut a deal with the prosecutors, who eventually dropped the charge, and instead of facing serious consequences, Jason simply pleaded guilty to misdemeanor charges. He paid the fines and then got on with his life. And fast forward to 2023, and things get even worse. On April 19th, Aurora police found Jason drunk after a wreck. This time, the 52-year-old was driving a motorcycle, a 2000 Indian to be exact, and official police records state that Jason first crashed the bike into a brick sign at the Aurora gas station, where he had coincidentally bought a bottle of vodka earlier in the evening. Jason was then taken to the hospital, but he refused to provide a blood sample to test his alcohol level. But the police said that they smelled alcohol on him at the scene and charged him with drunk driving, and immediately suspended his license again. But in September of 2023, Jason cut a deal and avoided a drunk driving conviction by pleading guilty to again a misdemeanor charge of losing physical control of his motorcycle. And by this point, his records showed a clear pattern. He gets drunk, drives his vehicle with a loaded weapon, gets caught, pleads guilty to something less severe, and repeats it all over again. But then, just a few months before the Taco Bell shooting, Jason was arrested again, and this time what happened was serious enough that it should have kept him locked up, or at least permanently disarmed. Because on March 26, 2024, 2024, which was less than 5 months before he killed Megan, Jason was pulled over by Hudson police after he was caught driving the wrong way down a one-way street at night.
Stop the car. What are you doing? Put your hands on the wheel for me. Put your hands on the wheel. On the wheel. What are you doing, sir? You're driving the wrong way on a one-way street. What are you doing?
And when the officers approached his vehicle, they immediately detected a strong odor of alcohol. They asked Jason where he was headed, but he appeared confused and was unable to respond clearly. Now, the arrest report stated that Jason was severely impaired, very unstable on his feet, and slurring his words. And at one point during the stop, he admitted to the officers that he had, quote, drunk enough to be bad that night.
Okay, how much have you had to drink tonight? Enough to be bad?
Now, during that stop, the police found again a loaded .45 caliber semi-automatic pistol in Jason's vehicle, along with a spare loaded magazine. They also found a nearly empty bottle of Captain Morgan rum and a cup of clear liquid in the console.
Watch your step there. There's a curb here. We're gonna go on this sidewalk right over here, okay?
Okay.
Can you stand right here in front of me?
Sure.
And face toward me, okay? Alright. You okay?
Yeah, I'm good.
Jason was then charged with operating a vehicle under the influence, improper handling of a firearm in a vehicle, which is a felony, and several other offenses. And in April of 2024, a grand jury indicted him on these charges. But instead of being held in jail, Jason was released in May of 2024 on a $5,000 bond. Now, as part of his release conditions, he was restricted from owning any firearms. He was also ordered to get a scram alcohol monitoring bracelet, which is a device you wear on your ankle that detects if you've been drinking. However, Jason never actually got the scram bracelet, nor did he dispose of any of his guns. He simply didn't do them, and apparently nobody checked to make sure he complied with the court order. Now, surprisingly, records showed that 2 months before the March 2024 incident, Jason tried to get help for his dangerous behavior. In January of 2024, he actually called the mental health hotline and informed the person who answered that he was planning to check himself out of this world. And shortly after, local authorities were dispatched to his home for a wellness check. And when they arrived, they found Jason in what they described as a mental health crisis. Officers said that he was drinking wine straight from the bottle, and he even described to them a specific plan he had to unalive himself using 2 of his guns. Now, normally when police run into someone who is clearly falling apart, there are clear ways to intervene. Perhaps take him to a hospital, perform a psych evaluation, or maybe just remove the weapons. But none of that actually happened, and it wasn't really their choice. Ohio doesn't have a red flag law, which means that police or family can't actually ask a judge to temporarily take someone's guns, even if that person is clearly a danger to himself or others. So despite these warning signs, there was no legal way to actually remove Jason's firearms without his consent. Now, the police officers found an open treatment spot for him in Indiana, and they took him at his word that he would go there. Now, the really questionable part here is that there was no follow-up to make sure that he actually got treatment or that his guns were actually removed from his home. And that's how we got to this tragic situation. Now, 4 days after the Taco Bell shooting, hundreds of people gathered on the front lawn of Stowe City Hall for a candlelight vigil in Megan's honor. And the same month, Megan's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit arguing her death could have been prevented. But as of now, the lawsuit names only Jason Williams' estate as the defendant, and no other person or organization have been added yet. Now, fortunately, a year after Megan's death, Ohio Senator Casey Weinstein introduced a bill called the Megan's Way Out. And basically, this bill requires new drive-thrus to have an escape lane, so drivers aren't actually trapped in emergency situations. And as heartbreaking as Megan's story is, this next case is even more unsettling, because this time there were no warning signs at all.
Dorian Carver went to work at Taco Bell in Scott Township on November 9th, but never made it home.
On November 9, 2022, just after noon in Scott Township, Pennsylvania, 32-year-old Dorian Carver walked out of the Taco Bell on Cork Run Road, where he'd been working his shift. Now, a few minutes earlier, he and his manager, 23-year-old Zaire Simmons, had gotten into a heated argument inside the restaurant, loud enough that customers in the dining room could actually hear them. So as Dorian walked out of the building and headed down to Cork Run Road, Zaire followed him outside. And what happened next turned a bad day at work into a case that Allegheny County would never forget. Now, before we get into what happened next, it helps to understand who Dorian was. Born on November 1st, 1990, Dorian lived in Natrona Heights in Harrison Township, just outside Pittsburgh. He was the son of Richard Carver and Carmela Wilson. His siblings, Chiffon Carver and Jerail Carver, said Dorian was caring and the kind of brother who would drop everything to help others. His mother, Carmela, said he was a protector and a beloved son, someone their family was deeply proud of. He worked at the Taco Bell on Cochrane Road, and by all accounts, he showed up, did his job, and avoided any major issues. Zaire, on the other hand, was younger, only 23 at the time, and his background was very different from Dorian's. According to records, he grew up in foster care and moved between homes throughout his childhood. And by his teenage years, he'd already seen repeated violence, as he witnessed a shooting at a playground in Pittsburgh's Homewood neighborhood. He also lost his older brother and his best friend to violence. And despite all that, Zaire worked his way up at the Taco Bell on Cochran Road, eventually becoming a shift manager, which meant that he had authorities over other employees, including Dorian. But outside of work, their dynamic looked very different. Despite being Dorian's manager, Zaire depended on him and his fiancée, who we're going to be calling Jenna. Zaire needed rides to work and home after his shifts. This act of generosity to Zaire, however, wouldn't stop what happened between them on November 9, 2022. That morning started like any other. Customers came in and out, and orders went out as usual, until around noon, when Zaire handed Dorian a written warning for a policy violation. Now, the exact details of this warning were never made public, but whatever was written on that paper made Dorian really angry, and the two men started arguing inside the restaurant, and according to witnesses, it didn't stay verbal for long. Dorian shoved Zaire, who shoved back, and two line cooks quickly stepped in to pull them apart before things escalated. Now, once they were separated, Dorian walked out of the Taco Bell completely, heading down Cochran Road toward the Northwestern Mutual building. He tried to get away from the argument and walked into the Northwestern Mutual's lobby to call Jenna for a ride, as he'd left his phone at Taco Bell. But before he could actually make the call, Zaire walked in right behind him with his hand tucked inside his jean jacket, and inside that lobby, the argument resumed right where it left off. And then Zaire pulled out a .40 caliber handgun, loaded the chamber, and fired. Dorian was shot twice before he collapsed on the tile floor. Zaire then turned and fled the scene, gun still in hand. Now, the first 911 calls came within seconds. Scott Township police officers arrived first and found Dorian in the lobby, where he was immediately pronounced dead. And because the shooter, Zaire, fled, the response quickly escalated into a large search for an armed suspect. And so multiple departments, including SWAT, moved in, while nearby schools like Lincoln Elementary, Jefferson Elementary, and Jefferson Middle School were placed on lockdown. Even people at the Bethel Church and the nearby Giant Eagle store were told to remain indoors. Now, not long after that, Allegheny County Police arrived and took over the homicide investigation. And as the search expanded, Mount Lebanon Police also pushed out a suspect description. And seeing countless officers searching for an armed shooter had locals worried for their safety.
They had rifles, AK-47s, which was, I thought something really bad was happening.
Fortunately, staff at Northwestern Mutual confirmed that none of their employees or clients were hurt. Now, later on, police would recover the .40 caliber handgun used in the shooting behind a vacant building next to the Northwestern Mutual office. And forensic testing later confirmed that the gun matched the shell casings recovered at the scene, leading detectives to believe that Zaire simply dropped it there as he ran. Now, despite all the witnesses' accounts and the gun being recovered, hours passed, and there was still no sign of Zaire. Then, around 7:45 that evening, roughly 7.5 hours after the shooting, Zaire walked into an Allegheny County Police Station and turned himself in, though his reason for surrendering wasn't actually announced to the public.
We're just still like in shock, because here he went to work. All he did is go to work. And then for him to end up dead at work? It makes no sense.
Zaire was charged with criminal homicide, but that wasn't actually all. Detectives also traced the .40 caliber pistol and found it had been reported stolen. So Zaire also received separate firearm-related offenses, including receiving stolen property and carrying a firearm without a license. And so on January 13, 2023, about 2 months after the shooting, Zaire appeared in district court for his preliminary hearing, where prosecutors were expected to present enough evidence for the charges to move forward. However, Zaire waived his rights to the hearing, so all charges against him went straight to trial. And during the hearing, members of Dorian's family were present in the courtroom. This included his aunt, Adrienne Young, who understood this laws better than most. She was a victim advocate and the director of Tree of Hope, a faith-based anti-violence organization in Pittsburgh, which she founded more than 20 years earlier after her own son was killed. He was just 18.
The ultimate justice is for him to never, ever see daylight again. For him to think about what he did every day that he's in that jail cell.
Now, 4 weeks later, on February 14th, Zaire was arraigned in common pleas court and pleaded not guilty. Now, his defense team actually didn't dispute Zaire firing the gun. In fact, Zaire actually admitted on the stand that he shot Dorian, but his defense team centered its case on the fear, arguing that Zaire thought Dorian was reaching for a weapon and fired because he believed he was about to be attacked. And according to Zaire's testimony, by the time they reached the Northwestern Mutual building, Dorian's hands were in his waistband, and Zaire believed Dorian might actually be hiding a weapon. But during the trial, the gun charges actually started falling apart. Jared Caruso charged Zaire with receiving stolen property for the gun and carrying a firearm without actually having a license. But when it came to present evidence on those accounts, Jared had nothing. He admitted in court that he'd been waiting for evidence that never arrived in time. He said he believed they might be able to find the person the gun was stolen from, but that never came through. And because of these, the defense moved to strike both gun counts. And the judge actually granted the motion and complained to Jared, saying, "When I'm telling a jury that Mr. Simmons is being charged with the gun gun being stolen, and they're just hoping and guessing and praying that you're going to produce a witness. That is not the way this is supposed to happen. And the jury was then told to disregard the gun charges, and they only focused on the homicide count alone. And after only 9 hours, they reached a verdict. On February 4th, 2025, the jury found Zaire guilty of first-degree murder, and under Pennsylvania law, that conviction carries a mandatory sentence of life in prison without parole. And so on May 1st, 2025, Judge Beamer handed down the sentence, and Zaire was taken into custody to begin serving life without parole. And for Dorian's family, it looked like justice had been finally served after 2.5 years of waiting. But a month later, everything fell apart. In June, Zaire's new attorney, Ryan James, filed a motion for a new trial. He argued that even though the gun charges were dropped, the damage was already done. The jury had heard from the very beginning that Zaire was charged with carrying a stolen gun. Information had painted him as dishonest and dangerous before a single piece of evidence was presented, and James argued that this kind of prejudice couldn't be erased just by telling the jury to forget about it. And so in August of 2025, Judge Beamer agreed. He set aside Zaire's conviction and ordered a new trial. Dorian's family was devastated when they got the news.
Like, we were just starting to calm down and settle down and start to grieve our son, and now all of a sudden that little band-aid that got over the gaping wound is just ripped off.
And so after a lot of back and forth, a new trial date was set for February 17th, 2026, where Judge Beamer would decide if Zaire got another trial or if his case would be dismissed completely. And so nearly 3 years after Dorian was shot and killed while trying to walk away from a workplace argument, his family is still waiting to see if Zaire could get out of prison because of a prosecutor's negligence, leaving them with no justice. Unlike this case, which ended in a surrender within hours, the next one turned into a full-blown manhunt that had civilians fearing for their lives.
And they had their guns drawn just like you see on TV.
On the evening of November 10th, 2015, Jeanette Pokes was at home with her boyfriend, Elton David Croquette, when he left to meet someone about a jewelry deal. She told him not to go, because something about it just didn't feel right. He seemed uneasy too, because before walking out the door, he took off most of the jewelry he normally wore and grabbed a gun instead. Jeanette warned him again, but he simply brushed it off and promised that he would be back soon. Little did she know that nothing would be the same after that night. David was a 48-year-old man who lived in Louisville, Kentucky. He fathered 3 daughters from a previous relationship, Charlissa, Jessica, and Elizabeth. He was also a grandfather to another kid named Emma Rose. Now during the week, David worked at the Essex Nursing and Rehabilitation Center, looking after elderly residents and rehab patients. David's co-workers described him as gentle and the kind of guy who kept his head down. But on weekends, David worked at the flea market. Every Saturday and Sunday, he set up a booth at Derby Park Flea Market, a large outdoor market where vendors sold everything from antiques and electronics to used items. There, he actually sold gold chains, rings, watches, and other jewelry, while also buying old pieces from people to resell for profit. Now, vendors described David as friendly and easygoing, so it wasn't unusual for him to meet buyers or sellers outside the market when it was more convenient. And on Tuesday, November 10th, 2015, David arranged a jewelry meetup with several people. He contacted one of the buyers the day before at the flea market, and they chose a Taco Bell on Dixie Highway to handle the transaction. Now, this particular Taco Bell was located in the Valley Station area, a busy, well-lit spot where cars came through and people went in and out. The parking lot circled the building, and on the side, away from the drive-thru, there was just a small waiting area, and it was there around 7:30 p.m. that customers in the drive-thru, people in parked cars, and staff inside the restaurant heard 3 loud shots and froze. And when people nearby realized someone had been shot, 911 calls started going out almost immediately. Louisville Metro police officers and emergency services rushed to the scene, and when they arrived, he was found lying in the parking lot. David had been shot multiple times with a pool of blood beneath him, and he was hardly breathing. Emergency services did everything they could, but a few minutes later, David was pronounced dead. The managers at the Taco Bell restaurant locked the doors to keep the customers safe, while police set up the crime scene tape and closed off sections of the parking lot. Meanwhile, detectives photographed the scenes while officers moved through the lot, cataloging every shell casing across the pavement. And by the next morning, Louisville Metro Police confirmed that they were investigating a homicide. Detectives were going door to door asking questions, talking to anyone who might have been near the Taco Bell the night before, and they pulled the surveillance footage from nearby businesses, hoping that someone's camera had caught a car leaving or a person running away, but they actually found nothing. Now, what the police didn't say publicly though was that they already had leads. They arrived at 2 names, 39-year-old Larry Caffey and 34-year-old Angela Tingle, and so the police began tracking down Larry and Angela, but they refused to tell the press how they figured out the pair was connected to David. And 3 days later, on November 13th, around 11:30 a.m., Louisville Metro Police spotted a vehicle on Westport Road with Larry and Angela inside, so they moved in to stop it. But instead of pulling over, Larry, who was driving, hit the gas and took off, and officers chased him all the way to a shopping center near St. Matthews. Matthews. Now during the pursuit, Larry rammed 2 police cruisers and hit a parked vehicle. Now he kept driving into St. Matthews before the chase ended on Deldridge Drive when the car crashed behind a home. Now the duo ran from the car and forced their way into a nearby house to hide, and since officers couldn't pinpoint their exact location, they brought in K9 units to help with their search. Schools in the area went on lockdown as residents watched from their windows fearing for their lives, while the officers searched front lawns, porches, and backyards. And the entire search lasted into the early afternoon, before Larry and Angela were found hiding inside a home and taken into custody around 1:30 p.m. However, the charges they were arrested for weren't for David's murder. Instead, the police brought them in because they knew that the duo had information about what happened in the Taco Bell parking lot, though neither of them were actually the shooter, which meant whoever pulled the trigger was still out there. And according to Angela's statement to the police, she wasn't present when the shooting happened. Larry actually drove a car to meet David in the Taco Bell parking lot with a 47-year-old man named Dennis Ray Stinnett and an unidentified woman in the backseat. Larry told her that David got into the front seat of the car with the jewelry, and after a few moments pulled a gun on Dennis. And according to Larry, this actually caused Dennis to react first and shoot David. However, before this incident, Dennis already had a long criminal history, going back decades, including burglary, robbery, and multiple drug offenses. Detectives recovered $62,500 in stolen jewelry before he was convicted and sent to prison. And so now, using Angela's statement and his prior record, police tracked Dennis down later that day, arrested him, and charged him with David's murder. His .45 caliber handgun was recovered, and Dennis admitted that it was the gun used to kill David. And so in total, he was charged with murder, tampering with physical evidence, possession of a handgun by a convicted felon, and possession of a defaced firearm. His bond was set to $100,000. And so the arrest gave David's family a brief sense of relief. On Saturday, November 14, 2015, family and friends gathered to honor David. His funeral was held in Campbellsville, the town where he grew up, with his family and close friends in attendance. Now the very next day, Dennis made his first court appearance. And despite the initial murder charge, the case didn't actually go to trial. Instead, it moved through the court system for more than 2 years before Dennis took a plea deal. Dennis claimed that David pulled a gun on him first, creating uncertainty about how the shooting actually unfolded. And so those questions actually made it difficult for prosecutors to prove intent to kill. And so as a result, the murder charge was reduced. And so on April 26, 2018, Dennis ultimately pled guilty to second-degree manslaughter instead. Now Larry was also booked for 16 counts, including 3 of reckless endangerment of police officers, assault, and actually methamphetamine possession, while Angela was charged with burglary and possession of drug items. But our next story is even more shocking, eventually becoming one of the deadliest hostage situations in American history.
A robbery allegedly committed by the two, a robbery where not only money was taken, but life.
On the morning of January 26, 1991, just before 1 a.m., a Taco Bell on Valley View Lane, Irving, Texas, was closing for the night. Inside the building were 3 employees. Teresa Fraga, 23-year-old Frank Fraga, and 28-year-old Michael John Peelan. What none of them realized, however, is that in a matter of minutes, that morning would take a very disturbing turn. Teresa lived in Irving, Texas, and worked as a crew member at Taco Bell on Valley View Lane. She was already raising a 1-year-old daughter, and at the time, she was 4 months pregnant with her second child. Now she came in for a shift that evening, where her 23-year-old cousin Frank Fraga worked alongside her. Now Frank lived in Dallas, Texas, but he and Teresa were close, and the job at Taco Bell gave them a chance to spend time as a family, while they also earned a paycheck. Now Frank was very friendly, and his close friends described him as someone who showed up on time and did the work without complaint. Frank was really known for a strong work ethic, but when it actually came to closing up the restaurant each night, that responsibility usually fell to Michael, because he was actually the assistant manager and lived in Fort Worth, Texas. Now Michael had worked his way up in the company and took his job seriously. Now less than a mile away, 19-year-old Jesse Carlos San Miguel drove through Irving and headed towards the same Taco Bell restaurant. Now Jesse had actually dropped out of school in 10th grade and was well known to local police because he'd been arrested 9 times and had even been accused of shooting a man. But despite all of that, he still applied for a job at the same Taco Bell and had been turned down. Now inside that Taco Bell, 17-year-old Jerome Mike Green was also worked part-time there and was a close friend of Teresa, but his shift ended around 11 p.m. And after Jerome clocked out and left for the night, the remaining employees began their usual closing routine. The 3 cleaned the kitchen, locked the front doors, closed the registers, and gathered the night's cash. Now Michael was responsible for the time lock safe, which was programmed to open only at a set time, which meant that he had to wait a while for it to open before actually storing the money inside. Now while the trio cleaned up, Seung Chang Wing, a family friend of the Fragas, parked outside and waited to give them a ride home, completely unaware that danger was actually very nearby, because less than 100 feet away from him, Jerome actually met with Jesse outside the building, who parked nearby, and together they waited for an opportunity to actually break into the restaurant. And the opportunity came when one of the 3 opened the back door to take out the trash, and when the door swung open, the duo forced their way into the building, armed with guns and masks to protect their identity. It was pretty much an instant inside job. Now once inside, they rounded up the employees and forced Michael to stand at the safe, making him wait for the time lock mechanism to release so it could be opened. And while they waited, one of them took Teresa and Frank to the back of the restaurant and forced them into the walk-in freezer. Now one of them actually noticed someone waiting in his car, so they also forced them out at gunpoint, marched them inside, and shoved them into the freezer with Teresa and Frank. Now when the time lock safe finally opened, Michael handed over the cash and was also forced into the freezer. The total amount they stole was approximately $1,390, which they then stuffed into Taco Bell takeout bags before leaving the restaurant. Now a few minutes after they left, Jesse actually turned around and went back inside. He walked to the freezer, pulled the door open, and looked at the 4 people huddled inside. Then he asked them to give him one good reason why he shouldn't kill them. And when no one actually gave him the answer he was looking for, he pulled out a 9mm pistol and fired. Now 4 hours later, around 5 AM, Irving police spotted a pickup truck moving oddly less than a mile from the Taco Bell on Valley View Lane. They pulled it over outside a convenience store based on suspicion that the driver was drunk. And during the stop, one officer actually noticed a Taco Bell takeout sack on the front seat stuffed with wads of cash. And after a brief search of the truck, officers found 2 stocking masks, 2 pairs of gloves, a jammed 9mm automatic pistol that smelled like it had been fired recently, and a large amount of cash stuffed inside another Taco Bell bag. Now Jesse and Jerome were arrested for reckless driving, suspicion of drunk driving, and driving with an expired inspection sticker. But despite only being arrested for that, the officers still radioed in the drunk drivers and the stolen cash. And they began checking Taco Bell restaurants in Irving. And since the fast food chain had 6 restaurants in the city at the time, investigators made calls and drove to each location. And so in the early hours of the same day, Captain TJ Hall and other officers arrived at the Valley View Lane location and found it to be closed. The front doors were locked, the lights were off, and of course no one was able to answer when they knocked. Now the officers then actually decided to break it through the drive-thru window, and this is where they found the registers to be closed and the kitchen clean. But when they walked toward the back of the restaurant and opened the walk-in freezer, they saw all 4 inside, shot in the head, lying in a massive pool of blood. Michael and Frank had each been shot twice in the back of the head. Teresa, who was again 4 months pregnant, had also been shot twice. Sid had been shot in the shoulder, but the bullet actually traveled through his neck and exited near his nose. Now after the discovery, the officers immediately secured the scene and called for homicide detectives. And within hours, investigators swarmed the restaurant. They photographed the crime scene and collected all the evidence they needed. And back at the police station, the detectives then began interrogating Jerome and Jesse, but neither of them really talked.
Officers finding suspects before they trace their alleged victims. Police were led to the murder scene by a traffic stop at this intersection several blocks from the restaurant.
Now because of this, investigators moved quickly to search Jesse's home in Irving, where they recovered items linking him to the crime, including clothing with gunpowder residue. Now while authorities worked to build their case, the effects of the crime was actually felt by many people across Irving and the Dallas-Fort Worth area. The families of the 4 held vigils and funerals in their memory. Now especially Teresa, because of her age, her pregnancy, and the fact that she was already a mother, drew strong support and anger from the public, which actually prompted many people to be furious when they learned that Jesse had been freed on a $45,000 bond for existing weapons and burglary charges at the time of the murders. Now fortunately, once local authorities had enough evidence, Jesse and Jerome were formally charged with 4 counts of capital murder, 1 for each victim, and were held without bail. Now because Jerome was 17 at the time of the murders, he couldn't actually receive the death penalty under Texas law. Now under the felony murder rule, his participation in the robbery made him equally responsible for what happened inside. And so in 1992, he pleaded guilty to capital murder in exchange for a reduced sentence. He received a 50-year prison term and became eligible for parole in 2004 after serving only about 13 years. However, being eligible didn't actually mean he could be released, and he actually remained incarcerated after his parole was denied. And so under the terms of his sentence, he won't be expected to complete his full term until 2042. However, this wasn't the same for Jesse. He was already 19, and so his trial with the charges of 4 counts of capital murder took place in 1991. Now at the time, Texas Attorney General John Kernan presented the public and jury with extensive evidence of violent behavior, including a testimony that Jesse had actually threatened a classmate with a knife before later knocking him unconscious. He also shot another student in the stomach before a confrontation, shot into a teenager's home after a dispute, and repeatedly took part in violent fights he often started. And so after a brief discussion, the jury actually voted for the death penalty. And so Judge Harold Enns formally sentenced Jesse to death. Now Jesse of course appealed his conviction and argued that racial stereotyping influenced his death sentence. And during a death row interview, he said, "The evidence is so obvious that I had a very unfair trial. They did not base the decision on my history, on my individuality. It was based on me being a Mexican. There's nothing I could do to stop what happened. People react in the heat of the moment. When something happens out of instinct, we just do it. We don't do it out of intent. We don't do it on purpose. It just happens." However, of course, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals rejected his claims and left his conviction and death sentence in place. And so on June 29, 2000, nearly 9.5 years after the murders, Jesse Carlos San Miguel, 28 now, was executed by lethal injection. The execution took place in Huntsville, Texas, as 6 members of his victims' victims' families watched him die. He was pronounced dead at 6:19 p.m. But the next Taco Bell case would grow into one of Georgia's most fiercely disputed murder convictions.
Inman was convicted of killing a Taco Bell manager in Adel, Georgia.
Donna Brown was 40 years old, and everything in her life revolved around her 7-year-old son. As a single mother in Georgia, she raised him and paid the bills, and she spent most of her time working in the fast food industry, trying to give her son a better life. Now, by September of 1998, her dedication had finally paid off, and she was promoted to night manager at the local Taco Bell, putting her in charge of closing the restaurant each night. Now, on the morning of September 19, 1998, Donna was closing the restaurant only for the second time at the location. She was still learning the routine, including taking the day's deposit to the bank drop box down the road. Now, around 2 a.m., Donna finished counting the money and sealed $1,732 in a deposit bag, and she walked outside her car with the bag in her hand. However, an unknown man was waiting near the entrance, tucked into a corner. He let her get close, came up behind her, and hit her on the head. Donna immediately dropped to the pavement, and while she was barely conscious, the masked man shot her, grabbed the cash and her keys, and then drove away. Now, when Donna failed to return home after a shift, her close relatives contacted local authorities, and within a few hours, officers arrived at the Taco Bell and discovered that she'd been shot once through her right eye, with the open deposit bag beside it. They also realized that her car was missing, and so they immediately began searching the surrounding area for the stolen vehicle. And shortly after, they found the car abandoned in the parking lot of a closed restaurant, which had been damaged after it was driven into a chain link fence at the entrance. Now, after the initial investigation, police returned Donna's car to her family, and it was then that the relative actually noticed a homemade ski mask still inside, one that police had somehow overlooked. And so they alerted investigators, who collected it and locked it into evidence. Now, in the small town Adel that they lived in, a murder as public and brutal as Donna's placed immediate pressure on the police to solve the case fast. Now, Agent Jamie Steinberg led the investigation, as the police interviewed employees as well as witnesses and began working through what little evidence they actually had. And within actually 24 hours, a local drug dealer named Zachary Payne told investigators to look into a man named Devonia Inman. He didn't actually know him well, but Devonia had pointed a gun at him just days before the murder, and Zachary thought he was capable of something like this. Now, investigators also spoke to Larissa Chapman, who'd been working the closing shift that night. Now, she initially told them that she'd seen nothing unusual outside the restaurant, but 5 days later, after a suspect had already been taken into custody, investigators returned to re-interview witnesses, and when they got back to Larissa, she said that while waiting in the parking lot for a ride, she'd heard a voice coming from nearby bushes and recognized it as Devonia's. She described the man as bald and wearing a white tank top. Now, Devonia Inman was 20 years old and had only been in Adel for about 2 months. He was the father of a young boy, Trevensky Jackson, and in 1998, he moved from California after his mother, Dina Ray, sent him to live with relatives, hoping to pull him away from the troublesome company he was keeping back at home. Now, he'd actually already previously pleaded guilty in 1995 to a felony charge of making terroristic threats. And fast forward to September 21st, 1998, 2 days after the murder, the police actually decided to arrest Devonia at his aunt's house, but actually on an outstanding probation violation. And while he was in custody, 3 more people came forward and gave statements, placing him at the center of the case. Marquetta Thomas, the sister of Devonia's girlfriend, told investigators that on the day of the murder, Devonia came to her house, acting nervous and strange. She said that his clothes had blood on him and that he carried a large amount of cash. Then investigators heard from Kwame Spalding, an inmate who shared a cell with Devonia after his arrest. Kwame actually told investigators that Devonia had confessed while they were locked up together. Kwame said Devonia described hiding in the bushes and waiting for Donna to come out. And according to him, Devonia said he tried to grab the deposit bag and then shot Donna with a revolver. And finally, Virginia Tatum, a newspaper carrier, told investigators that she drove her delivery route near the Taco Bell before dawn on September 19th. And according to her, she saw Donna's car speeding away from the area and said that she got a clear look at the driver. Now, Virginia said the driver abandoned Donna's car and left in a second vehicle with a different person inside. But instead of opening a case for the driver that aided his escape, the state simply used their claim to strengthen its case against Devonia. And with all those statements in hand, the prosecution charged Devonia with murder, armed robbery, theft, and a gun charge, which was based entirely on the allegation that he'd used a firearm during Donna's murder and that as a convicted felon, he wasn't permitted to possess one. And this is where it gets interesting. The trial began on June 11, 2001, and District Attorney Catherine Harris Helms and Assistant District Attorney Kimberly Whiddon opened for the state, citing Devonia Inman's 1995 felony conviction to tell the jury why he couldn't actually legally own a gun, and then moved on to the crime scene evidence. Now, the medical examiner testified that Donna was shot while she was on the ground, with the muzzle about a feet from her head when the gun was fired, and the bullet that came from the scene came from a .44 special revolver. But when the witnesses actually took stand, suddenly the story began to fall apart. First, Marquetta confessed that basically I made the entire story up just to get him out of the picture, because Marquetta actually wanted to keep her sister from Devonia and thought that getting him in trouble with the police would do that.
So you made it up? Basically, I made it up. Yeah, just to get him out the picture because I was so hurt and crushed because she still really wanted to be with him. She liked him, and I'm like, I can't stand my this dude just beat on my baby sister.
She also said that investigators kept coming to her job, taking her out to eat, riding around with her. And at 18 or 19, she got caught up in it. But now that it was 3 years later, and she'd been incarcerated herself, sitting in county jail while Devonia's trial was underway, she began to understand what she'd done. Now, Larisha also took back her statements, telling the jury she was just making that up because she was tired of detectives calling her. Now, already 2 of the 4 witnesses had just admitted under oath, but Kwame and Virginia actually stayed true to their original statements. And yet, even after Marquetta and Larisha backed away from their stories, the prosecutors told the jury to trust what they first told police. And under Georgia's law, those earlier statements could actually still be treated as evidence. But Devonia's defense team, including attorney Melinda Riles, decided to go for a different story. They argued that the real killer was someone who actually worked at the Taco Bell with Don. His name was Hercules Brown, who, despite sharing her last name, had no relation with Don. And his defense team actually found 3 witnesses who were willing to testify that Hercules recruited them to help with the robbery. And so during the trial, they filed motions and raised the issue with the court. But when it actually came to it, it was ruled against the defense and the testimony was kept out. And so on June 25th, 2001, the jury returned guilty verdicts. And the next day, Devonia was sentenced to life without parole. Now the conviction gave Donna's Brown family a sense of closure. But for Dina, Devonia's mother, the verdict was heartbreaking because she truly believed that the state had convicted the wrong man. I want justice for my son. I pray to God that I'm alive to see him walk out of prison a free man. But after sentencing, Devonia was transferred to Augusta State Medical Prison to begin serving his time. His son Travinsky was still an infant and too young to actually understand where his father had gone or why. And as the years passed, Travinsky grew up around prison visits, and he sat across from Devonia in visiting rooms and spoke to him through the glass. But the story doesn't actually end here. 213 days before the trial ever began, on November 10, 2000, while Devonia sat in jail waiting for his trial, another man walked into Bennett's grocery in the middle of the day. The owner, William Carroll Bennett, was behind the counter. He was the person the store was named after, and in a town that small, most people knew exactly who he was. Now, also working that day was a clerk named Rebecca Ann Browning. Now, the man who walked into the store had an accomplice, Wesley Mason Jr., and together they came to rob the place. And moments after they entered the store, they picked up baseball bats and beat William Carroll Bennett and Rebecca Browning until they killed them. Now, a random customer, Wayne Peters, was also severely beat but barely survived. Now, within days, the police arrested the 2 men for the attack at Bennett's grocery. And the first man, Wesley, pleaded guilty and received life in prison without the possibility of parole. Now, the other man was Hercules Brown, and he also pleaded guilty and received the same sentence. This was the same Hercules that Devonia's team had tried to present as the real killer of Donna Brown. Now, after Devonia's conviction became final, his lawyers filed appeals and post-conviction motions over the years, arguing that the trial was unfair and that there was no physical evidence tying him to the crime. But the court still denied each effort and left the conviction in place. And for more than a decade, nothing would change. But then in 2011, the Georgia Innocence Project, a non-profit that fights wrongful convictions, took the case. And fortunately for them, DNA testing had actually advanced since 1998, and so the attorneys focused on a key item from the original investigation, the ski mask found in Donna's car. And so they filed a motion to test it, and after a legal fight, the court actually granted the request. And later that year, the results came back, and the DNA on the inside of the mask matched Hercules. But the DNA result wasn't the worst of it. The state had actually known about Hercules all along, because in September of 2000, months before Devonia's trial and weeks before the Bennett's grocery murders, police pulled Hercules over outside a supermarket in Adel, and after searching his car, they found a gun and cocaine, and he was arrested and charged on these counts. And the police actually found 2 items in the trunk, a handgun and a homemade ski mask cut from fabric with eye holes. And the police actually also documented the stop and the items in a report, and under the Brady rule, the state had a duty to turn over evidence that could help the defense. But Devonia's team actually never saw it back then. It stayed buried for years until the defense pulled the police file during post-conviction work. And so Devonia's defense team went back to court seeking a new trial, and this time they called Hercules to the stand. But he of course refused to testify, and without Hercules actually saying anything in court, the state still argued that it didn't prove that Devonia was innocent, and so they kept pushing the idea that both men could have been involved. But in January of 2014, Kwame actually came forward saying, basically everything was coerced. The detective was telling me he'll let me go home and stuff to say about the man. And during this period, Lee Grimes, a former co-worker of Virginia Tatum, revealed that Virginia didn't actually go to the investigators until a month after the crime, when she discovered the $5,000 reward. Now 2 years later, on February 24, 2016, an investigative series by the Atlanta Journal-Constitution called DNA Denial brought the case to a much larger mainstream audience, and around the same time, Jessie Gable-Sino became a visible part of Devonia's effort. She worked at the law school clinic at Georgia State University and collaborated with the Georgia Innocence Project, and she also visited Devonia in prison and brought law students into the work. And so by 2018, a new legal team had taken on Devonia's case, and they filed a legal request asking the court to review whether his continued imprisonment was lawful and whether he actually deserved relief. And so on September 19, 2019, the Georgia Supreme Court issued a decision that allowed Devonia's case to move forward. And with the case back in motion, the court then started looking hard at the physical evidence. And by June 2021, the judge finally treated the mask as strong evidence, tying it to Hercules. And so the court wanted to question him directly, and so they arranged to bring him out to testify while he was still in prison. But Hercules actually refused to leave his cell. Even if they forced him into the room, he would still refuse to answer on the record. So the testimony never even started. But 5 months later, Judge Christina ruled on the petition and granted Devonia a new trial because she found that the prosecutors actually violated his constitutional rights by not disclosing that Hercules had been arrested in September of 2000 with a similar homemade mask in his car. And so on September 20th, 2021, all of Devonia's charges were dropped. And so the same day, Devonia walked out of Augusta State Medical Prison after 23 years behind bars. He went in as a 20-year-old and walked out at 43. And waiting outside the prison were his mother, Dina Ray, and his son, Travensky Jackson. He also had a granddaughter now, 3-year-old Alona. But in our next case, the truth comes out much faster. Yet what the killer did in those few hours made it even harder to forget.
Four Taco Bell employees were closing down their store for the night. But little did they know, a man was hiding inside the ceiling, getting ready to murder everyone.
In January 1994, 19-year-old Courtney Matthews was serving at Fort Campbell, a military base on the Tennessee-Kentucky border just outside Clarksville. He lived in a duplex on Ryder Avenue with 2 other roommates, soldier Carl Ward and Carl's wife, Shante. Now Courtney actually needed money to make repairs on a friend's car, so he started looking for part-time work, and on January 19, 1994, he walked into the Taco Bell on Riverside Drive and applied for a job. Now the restaurant hired him as a crew member, and by that same week, he was working the late night shifts. Now 10 days into the job, on the night of January 29, 1994, Courtney clocked out of his shift at 9:11 p.m. while his colleagues stayed behind to finish up work. Amongst them were 22-year-old Kevin Campbell, who just got married and had a 2-week-old daughter, 22-year-old Angela Wyatt, and 39-year-old Patricia Mae Price, who was a mother of 5 who had only been married 3 months and had recently moved to Clarksville from Knoxville with her husband Michael. Now locking up the restaurant that night was a different person's job. It was 24-year-old Marsha Klopp's responsibility. She was the assistant manager on duty. She was also married and had 3 children of her own, and as far as anyone knew, the only people left inside were her crew. Now at around 1:45 that morning, John Ballard, a Taco Bell shift manager who was off that night, came through the drive-thru to check on Marsha. She told him that they were running behind and probably would not be able to leave until 3:30 or 4 a.m. And so John left and the restaurant stayed open for drive-thru. Now a few hours later, at 7:25 that morning, he returned to open the restaurant and noticed that all of the employees' cars were still in the lot. He unlocked the front door and went inside, and when he reached the back of the restaurant, he saw a body lying on the floor near the rear of the building. And frightened by the sight, he ran back outside, locked the door behind him, and called 911. Now soon, Officer Tony Blakely of the Clarksville Police Department entered the Taco Bell on Riverside Drive to find all 4 members of the closing crew dead inside the restaurant. Kevin, Angela, Patricia, and Marsha had each been shot multiple times, with some of the shots fired at close range, including shots to the head. Several of them also had injuries to their hands and arms. Now in the back office, the safe had been forced open and the locking dial blown off with a shotgun blast. There was around $3,000 missing, and shortly after, TBA agent Jeff Puckett took charge of the scene and organized a team to search the surrounding area. And near the McDonald's beside the Taco Bell, they actually recovered shotgun shells, a black wallet, a glove, and several coin wrappers. And further out, on the bank of the Red River, they found a black hooded jacket and a pair of white surgical gloves. Now outside the investigation, the 4 families were trying to make sense of what had happened, and while they made arrangements to bury their loved ones, the detectives began speaking to the rest of the staff. One of the first people they heard from was Jelaine Walker, another employee who left the restaurant shortly after midnight on the night of the murders. She recounted that on her way out of the Taco Bell that night, she'd seen Courtney still inside the building, even though he'd already clocked out hours ago. Now this caught the investigators' interest, so they looked further into him and learned he was a soldier at Fort Camp and had only been working at the Taco Bell for 11 days. They also spoke with Dean Marie Keller, the assistant manager who actually hired him, and Cherie Underwood, the team unit manager. And Marie told detectives that when she hired Courtney, he asked about the restaurant's layout, what happened after hours, and how the closing routine worked. He also asked about a key to the opposite exit door, whether there were cameras inside, and what the roof and drop ceiling looked like. She also told the police that on the day before the murders, he asked whether the back door would trigger an alarm if it was open from the inside. And those interviews pretty much filled in a timeline of what Courtney had been doing in the days leading up to the murders. And then one witness, James Bowen, came forward and told investigators he overheard Courtney actually planning the entire robbery on January 21st, 1994 at the Oak Grove trailer party. Now, while the detectives were gathering evidence, Courtney was breaking down because over the next few days, Shante and Carl noticed a change in him. He started keeping to himself and barely spoke, only staying in his room. And so on February 1st, Carl came home from work and found Courtney in a very bad way. He'd attempted to end his time on Earth and could barely speak. And as Carl tried to help him, Courtney told him that he did not deserve to go on. And in the same moment, he told Carl that he'd killed 4 people. Now, 2 days after the murders, Courtney actually told Shante that whoever carried out the killings had gone into the Taco Bell before it closed, made their way to the men's restroom, and climbed into the ceiling to wait. He said that 2 people were found in the kitchen and 2 in the storage area, and he described exactly how the safe had been opened and how the money had been taken. He told her details that weren't public yet. However, Shante did not go to the police. She only told investigators what she knew when they came to her. But on February 2nd, 1994, police brought Courtney in for questioning and searched his car. And in the back seat, investigators found a bowling bag, and hidden beneath a panel in the bottom was $2,576 in cash. And around the same time, the forensic results came back from the fingerprints lifted from the ceiling vent cover in the men's restroom, and they of course matched Courtney's. They were exactly where someone would have placed their hands to push aside a panel and pull themselves up into a ceiling. And the ballistics tied him to the shootings as well. A cartridge casing found in his room matched the 9mm casings recovered at the Taco Bell, and bullets from the scene matched fragments recovered from his bedroom floor. And so the same day, the police arrested Courtney and charged him with 4 counts of murder and robbery. He was held in a Montgomery County jail as the case moved toward trial. Now, investigators actually also arrested another man, David Gene Hauser, after James Bowen told police that David had been part of the conversation about robbing the Taco Bell at the party, leading them to suspect that he helped Courtney carry it out. On December 12, 1997, the court sentenced him to 4 consecutive life sentences, plus 20 years for the robbery. But as horrifying as that was, the next case would take the same kind of horror even further, becoming one of the deadliest and most chilling cases.
It was like, the switch was flipped and I was choking her.
Henry Louis Wallace was born on November 4th, 1965 in Barnwell, South Carolina. He was raised by his mother, Lottie Mae Wallace, along with his older sister, Yvonne, in a small home with no plumbing or electricity. Now, Lottie worked long hours and ran a pretty strict household, and when she felt that children needed punishment, she beat them with extension cords, garden hoses, and whatever else was nearby. And when she was too tired to do it herself, she made Henry and Yvonne whip each other. Now, despite this upbringing, Henry was pretty popular and well-liked at Barnwell High School. He was elected to the student council, and when his mother refused to let him play football, he joined the cheerleading squad instead. Now, after graduating from Barnwell High in May of 1983, Henry spent 1 semester at South Carolina State College, then another at Denmark Technical College, although he would eventually leave both schools without ever graduating. Now, around the same time, he worked evenings as a disc jockey at a small local radio station in Barnwell. He liked the attention and the performance side of it, but he was fired after he was caught stealing CDs from the station. And with college behind him and the radio job gone, Henry decided to join the US Navy in December of 1984 and was shipped out to recruit training in Orlando, Florida. Now, the Navy actually gave him purpose, and for several years he did well there. Henry rose to the rank of Petty Officer 3rd Class, which was a mid-level rank that came with responsibility over the sailors below. Now, one supervisor described him as an outstanding seaman who willingly followed orders, completed his assigned tasks on time, and demonstrated a level of knowledge that exceeded what was expected at his rank. Now, by 1987, Henry married his high school girlfriend, Moretta Brabham. Now, Moretta actually already had a daughter, Tiandra, and Henry decided to adopt her. And for a time, Moretta and Tiandra followed him as he was transferred to the West Coast and back again. But the marriage was already under strain because Henry wanted a child with Moretta, while she didn't want to have any more children. Now, in January of 1988, while stationed in Washington, he was actually arrested for breaking into a hardware store. And this is when things began to fall apart. It was also during this period that he began using drugs, including a white substance that you can put up your nose. Now, in June, he pleaded guilty to second-degree burglary and received 38 days in jail and 24 months of supervised probation. He was assigned to probation officer Patrick Sieber, but according to Patrick, he failed to show up for most of his mandatory meetings, and by 1990, a warrant had been issued for his arrest. Now, the same year, he returned to Barnwell to visit his family, and by this time, Henry was 24, and it was there that he ran into Tashanda Bethia again, a girl he'd known since childhood, who was now 18. Now, their families had known each other for years, as their mothers worked at the same factory and were close friends, and at some point, Henry and Tashanda had even briefly dated, but she pulled away from him, and he'd grown angry about it. Now, one day in March of 1990, he offered her a ride in his car, and she naturally got in. Now, pretty soon, an argument broke out in the car, and he decided to drive her toward a pond in western Barnwell County, which is where he suddenly attacked her, took her life, and then left her in the water. Now, when Tashana didn't come home for a while, her family reported her missing, and Barnwell police started asking questions. Now, Henry was one of the people they spoke to since he'd known her for years, and was already their prime suspect. Now, Henry was questioned, but denied any involvement, and was then released since there wasn't enough evidence to actually keep him there. But then on April 1st, 1990, two fishermen found her body in the pond, and the autopsy showed that she'd been choked to death. But the police still did not have enough evidence to charge Henry, so the case went cold. Now, in February of 1991, Henry decided to break into Barnwell High School and WDOG radio station, stealing video and recording equipment. He was eventually caught when he tried to pawn it, and would end up serving 4 months in state prison in Allendale. Now, within months of his release from prison, he was also discharged from the Navy, and his marriage to Moretta ended in divorce shortly after. He stayed briefly with his sister Yvonne in Rock Hill, but by late 1991, he decided to move to East Charlotte to start over again. Now, over the next several months, he cycled through fast food jobs near East End Mall, Taco Bell, Bojangles, Captain D's, and the Black Eyed Peas, losing some of them as the substance abuse began creeping in. Now, despite this, he eventually worked his way up to shift manager at a Taco Bell in Charlotte. Now, this job put him around young women every day. He supervised them and got to know them, and it was around this time that he also started dating Sadie McKnight, a young woman that also lived in East Charlotte. Now, Henry is 26 now, and at the same time, he's meeting other women in the area. In May of 1992, for example, Henry picked up Sharon Nance, a 32-year-old woman living in Charlotte. She had left her Aunt Linda's house that night in a black dress, talking about going out with friends. Now, she also had a son at home, and during the drive with Henry, she mentioned that Henry would have to pay her for any intimate activities they engaged in. Now, Henry didn't like this, and so the two got into an argument, and in the middle of the chaos, he then proceeded to beat her to death with a rock. He then drove to Russell's Ferry Road, dumped her body near the railroad tracks, and then drove off. And when Sharon didn't come home, nor called, Linda knew that something was wrong, and it wasn't until a week later, watching the news, that the family learned what had happened, as the police recovered Sharon's body on May 27th near Russell's Ferry Road. Now, the officers opened a homicide investigation again, secured the scene, and began retracing her last known movements, trying to find out who'd seen her. Now, the detective spoke to people who knew her, and worked the case as a single, separate killing. Now, during the investigation, Henry resumed his daily routine working as a manager at the Taco Bell restaurant, and during this period, he now started living with his girlfriend Sadie, and became close with Caroline Love, Sadie's roommate and co-worker at Bojangles. Now, on June 15th, 1992, Caroline finished her shift, got some quarters so she could do laundry, and then left for the apartment. Now, after her cousin Robert Ross drove her home, Caroline went inside, and Henry was already there. He'd entered the apartment with a copy of his key while both women were out, and when Caroline came in, he called out from the bathroom and said he would leave in a moment. But when he decided to come out, he went into the living room where Caroline was, kissed her on the cheek, and made a move on her. Now, she told him that she wouldn't tell Sadie if he promised not to do it again, but instead of accepting that deal, he decided to attack her, put her in a chokehold, and drag her into the bedroom, which is where he did unspeakable things to her, and then killed her. Now, once she was no longer breathing, Henry left briefly to move his car closer to the stairwell. He came back, wrapped Caroline's body in a bedsheet, and then placed it inside a large orange trash bag, and took her money from the dresser. He carried everything downstairs, loaded it into his car, and drove to Statesville Road, where he stopped and carried the bag into the woods. Now, the next day, he actually returned to the body, because he was worried that the orange bag could be seen from the road. So he removed her body from the bag and moved it into a nearby shallow ravine. Now, when Caroline didn't show up for work, the first call came from Bojangles. After she missed 2 shifts, her employer contacted her sister, Kathy Love, and Kathy went to the apartment and left a note. But when Caroline still didn't turn up the next day, the concern grew, and so Kathy reached out to Henry, who knew both women. Now, from there, Kathy, Sadie, and Henry went together to the police station to file a missing person report. Henry stood at the counter and answered the officer's questions about Caroline, and told him that he had no idea where she might be. Kathy went back to the apartment with investigators, and they started looking around. Now, the furniture had been slightly moved, and the bed sheets from Caroline's bedroom were gone, proving someone had been there. And investigator Anthony Rice retraced the last known movements, and spoke to her manager at Bojangles, who told them that the last time she saw her was the night she left work, and before she left, she traded a $10 bill for a roll of quarters. And so with no witnesses or a confirmed crime scene, the case stayed open as a missing person investigation. And so Henry simply went back to his shifts, spending evenings at Granville Apartments with friends. Now he was still around the same small circle of women, still slipping in and out of their daily lives. Now a different woman he talked to on the regular was Shauna Denise Hawk. Shauna was 20 years old, studying to become a paralegal, and working part-time at a Taco Bell store, where Henry had once been her manager before moving on to other jobs. She lived with her mother, Sylvia Sumter, who went by the nickname Dee. Now on February 19, 1983, Henry went to Shauna's home while her mother was still out, and the two spent time talking. Then, as he was getting ready to leave, he told her that he wanted to be intimate with her, but Shauna already had a boyfriend, so she resisted. But then he attacked her, dragged her into the bathroom, and ended her life. And before leaving, he took her keys and $50 from the wardrobe. Now later that evening, Dee came home and started making dinner. Now Shauna's car was gone, but her coat and purse were still in the house. Now Shauna was also supposed to pick up her godson, 2-year-old Jermyn Williams, and she hadn't actually done that. So of course Dee called Shauna's boyfriend, Daryl Kirkpatrick, but he hadn't seen her either. So she decided to check Shauna's purse and noticed that her keys and some money were missing. Now Daryl came over and the two decided to call the police to report her missing. And after that call, Daryl walked through the house and went downstairs to the bathroom and noticed that the carpet was soaking. He pulled the shower curtain and found Shauna in the bathtub. And so he ran upstairs and told Dee to call 911. Now the emergency crew arrived and tried to revive her, but she was pronounced dead at the hospital. Meanwhile, over the next 18 months from then on, Henry went on a killing spree. First, it was 24-year-old Audrey Spain, who'd come to Charlotte from South Carolina and ended up at Taco Bell working along Henry. Then 21-year-old Valencia Jumper, who was a political science major at Johnson Smith University and a close friend of his sister. After her, it was 20-year-old Michelle Stinson, who was studying graphic arts and had 2 young sons. 25-year-old Vanessa Mack, who knew him through his sister, who worked with him at Taco Bell, who also had a 4-month-old daughter. 24-year-old Betty Baucom, who was Sadie's co-worker at Bojangles, and 18-year-old Brandy Henderson, who was the girlfriend of one of Henry's closest friends. And each time he killed one of these women, he walked free and avoided suspicion. Now fast forward to March 10, 1994, and Sergeant Gary McFadden called his detectives together to compare the recent strangulation cases. Vanessa, Brandy, and Betty were all killed in their own apartments, and none of them showed any signs of forced entry. And so the investigators went back to the families and friends of each woman and asked who they would have trusted enough to let inside. And when those conversations came back, detectives were left with one common name: Henry Wallace. And so they now had a person. The only thing they needed was proof. Now Betty's abandoned car and Vanessa's bank card gave them 2 leads they could actually work with. Now Betty's car had been wiped clean, except for the fact that the person forgot to wipe the trunk, and so they were able to lift a palm print from the car, and it actually matched Henry's. As for Vanessa's card, surveillance footage from the ATM where someone had tried to use it after her death showed a man wearing a distinctive cross earring that matched the one Henry was known to wear. And so for the first time, investigators had physical evidence tying one man to multiple victims, and so they put out the word to find it, but Henry was still out there. Now, on March 12th, Lovey Slaughter went to her daughter's apartment, expecting to let herself in with her key, but when she put it in the lock, she realized that the door was already open. She walked in and found Deborah, her daughter, on the floor and called 911. Now Officer Ronnie Chambers responded and found Deborah face up on the floor. Her purse had been dumped out and she had a sock in her mouth, towels around her neck, and multiple puncture wounds in her chest. And the autopsy confirmed that she'd been strangled and stabbed 38 times with wounds that had pierced her heart and lung. But that same evening she died between 5 and 5:30 p.m. Officers actually found Henry hiding in the bathroom of a friend's apartment on the east side of Charlotte. But he was actually arrested on an outstanding warrant for shoplifting a $48 sweater from East End Mall. At least this was the official reasoning. Now officers took him to the law enforcement center rather than the usual intake facility on orders from their supervisor. And shortly before 7 p.m. the investigators were in the interview room with Henry to press him on the murders. Now in the early hours of March 13th, investigator Anthony Rice entered the room, and Henry already knew him from the Caroline case. But he did something unorthodox. Moments later, Anthony actually asked everyone to bow their heads. He took Henry's hand and led a prayer about thanks and repentance. And when it was over, he told Henry that it was time to cleanse his soul and actually tell the truth. And Henry actually broke down crying. He picked up a pen and wrote out the names of the women he'd killed. And by the time the interview was over, Henry had confessed to 9 murders in Charlotte. He also admitted to the earlier killings of Sharon Nance in Charlotte and Tashonda in South Carolina. And so just over 3 weeks after Henry confessed, on April 4th, 1994, a grand jury indicted him on 9 counts of first-degree murder, along with multiple intimate crime counts and robbery with a deadly weapon. He was held without bond. He was then sentenced to 9 death sentences, 1 for each murder. But as of 2026, he's not been executed. He still remains on death row.